Every few months I have to mention the old Donkey Kong Country and Land games. If not, I'll probably explode. I even wrote about the history of Donkey Kong in a book. I have a problem. Please stop enabling me to defend the Land games. I know no one else cares about them, but I do. Back in the 1990s, we had some really great platformers for the Game Boy, starring a hairy little guy who loved to accessorize with red, even if it was hard to make that out on that small monochrome screen. This platforming star was obviously Mario, from the hit Super Mario Land series, and these were condensed versions of what made his console games great, but for the burgeoning Game Boy market. Anyway, some gorilla stole this idea and did Donkey Kong Land and its 2 sequels, and those are actually good, I swear. Everyone's missing out because they only played the first one, which was, well, a cute attempt, or it would be if I could see what was happening. But this trilogy of Donkey Kong adventures on the Game Boy were a technical marvel, and Rare loved making this system do things it honestly shouldn't do, so of course they didn't stop there when their successor, the Game Boy Color, came out. We had Donkey Kong Land 3 get a Game Boy Color release for the Japanese market, and it's a good consolation prize for them not getting Land 3 the same time as the rest of the world, but unfortunately it isn't the definitive version, because they made the tragic mistake of not having Bear Bear animate, and I cannot forgive this. Once I get to Bear Bear in the Japanese version, I stop playing and delete my save file out of respect for the original animators. And for Game Boy Color, it had a few other notable games, I think like 3 or so, one of which blurred the lines between console and handheld, as we saw a fully featured Game Boy Color version of a previous console masterpiece. And it even came complete with a bunch of fun bonuses and minigame distractions. Obviously I'm talking about Super Mario Bros. Deluxe. To everyone who didn't own a Turbo Express, or a Game Gear, or a Nomad, which let's face it is everyone except that one kid in school you hated, this was an unbelievable breakthrough in technology. They crammed a popular console game onto a portable device. I know the Game Boy did things like Baseball and Yoshi, but I did specifically say popular games. This wasn't like a similar game to its console entries being handled by the B team. This is the full game, just with a tight zoom that's unbearable now, but this was the best we had back then. Anyway, Donkey Kong did the same thing, but it was even more impressive because this wasn't just a 16-bit game, but it was one of the most impressive ones. And all it had to sacrifice to be on the Game Boy Color was small things like its visuals, sound, controls, game feel, physics, and just the overall enjoyment. But look, it has 8-bit Winky, that makes up for everything. The most tragic part of this technological marvel is that the Game Boy Advance would come out just a year later, or even later the same year for the Japanese players. And that handheld not only destroyed the Game Boy Color in terms of its own power, it got its own Donkey Kong Country remake later on, and that is so much more feature complete and accurate to the original, and it really just further highlights all the areas that Country on Game Boy Color failed. And obviously nowadays we can just emulate the SNES original, including multiple official releases on Nintendo's portable machines. But at the risk of being pretentious, I enjoy this worst version a lot just for all the things it poorly emulates. And while this is the least playable version of DKC, it may be my favourite version of it overall just for how odd and unique it is. Okay, I think I scared off most of the viewers, but for you tenacious few, or more realistically, the people out there that are too lazy to stop the video and put something else on in the background, enjoy my defense of DKC GBC. That's a nice title, maybe I should have used that instead. And like I said earlier, this is a version you only play now for its oddities. No one is seriously playing this as the only way to play Donkey Kong Country. This is a novelty, and I'm not expecting it to feel just like the original. But if the box is to be believed, Donkey Kong Country is only on Game Boy Color. I'm not gonna argue with a box. Okay, we boot up the game, we see a different title card, and there's actually a few here for each time we boot up the game. And then we're welcomed by a horribly pixelated version of the Donkey Kong 64 menu. In some ways, this feels like the handheld side game to DK64. Country 1 had Land 1 a year later. Country 2 had Land 2 a year later. Country 3 had Land 3 a year later. And no surprise to anyone who can predict patterns, 64 had Country 1 Game Boy Color a year later. We have that, we had the main menu, and okay, it's not really much. But still, this menu stands out so much that it just had to be commented on. When we start a new file, we start off in Jungle Hijinks, obviously, and everything looks like an uglier version of Donkey Kong Country for SNES. But more importantly, it doesn't feel like it. This feels like the later Land games, like 2 and 3, but more interestingly, it uses the cast of Land 1. It's important to state that because Land 1 was a nice first attempt, but it is woeful to play in many areas. You'll find out later when I milk this franchise again. But Lands 2 and 3 not only tightened things up, they're actually a lot more fun to play, and they both had Dixie Kong, so you didn't need to be good at platforming to beat those games. Country on Game Boy has the best feel here. It feels like it's further improved from where Land 3 left off, and until the Game Boy Advance, this was the best approximation Rare had done. But without Dixie Kong, we actually need to be skilled at platforming, so at times this is a lot harder to play, even if it feels better in the moment mechanically. Poor Donkey Kong, should have been Dixie. That being said, I've always liked this original duo the most in this series, and I wouldn't trade them for Dixie or Kitty, maybe Cranky. It's just that with Donkey and Diddy being the two most vanilla Kongs, we really need to master their mechanics here, and there isn't any crutch to help us. And the relative ease of Lands 2 and 3 were also thanks to the animal buddies who were generally more useful than anything Land, or Country Game Boy Color, had for the matter. Squidder shot webs, Ellie shot water, Rattly is cute. These all help make it a better experience overall, but we have none of that here. Instead we just have the regular animal buddies from the first game, and they don't have any of their special enhancements they got in later games. Back onto Jungle Hijinks, this still has everything we know and love. Donkey Kong's house with his giant mysterious socks. That cave that always made me anxious as a kid because I didn't like seeing Donkey Kong be upset. And the treetops that we could use to get a huge amount of lives. Though doing that on the Game Boy is a lot more limited and harder to accomplish because of the physics here. They may have improved things, but this is still built on the flawed base of Land 1, but the level design wasn't built with this in mind. But that's okay, this is good enough. And that's the core underlying message of this version. Anyway, Diddy Kong is still found in barrels, and thanks to the limited sound hardware here, it's much more annoying when he's nearby because it interrupts these musical bops. And that's a shame because these tracks are all great. We have a mix of 8-bit renditions of classics and songs directly pulled from Donkey Kong Land, and while these weren't what the original levels had in mind, they all work well together. And this first level isn't complete without mentioning Rambi the Rhino. You might know him as the only rideable animal buddy in the Retro Studios games. He's much the same here as he was in the original, but he's also far worse because of the most odd feature in this game, one that makes it unlike anything we got prior. Okay, some backstory. In Donkey Kong Country 1, buddies like Rambi could be ridden, and upon being hurt the Kongs would fall off, but they would have the option to get back on as the buddy ran around in desperation. This is very much like Yoshi from Super Mario World. Land 1 kept this, with the only downside being the screen became an incomprehensible mess. The console sequels, Countries 2 and 3, also continued this on occasion, but they added sections where you'd transform into the animals instead of simply riding them. This was generally an improvement since it meant the levels would require these buddies and their 2-point health system. You wouldn't lose access to this buddy, you'd just lose a hit point, so the levels had to be built around it. Lands 2 and 3 on Game Boy only used the transformation barrels to become the buddies. In these games too, if you got hurt, you'd still stay as the animal buddy, and you'd continue in that form. You know, this is the obvious thing you'd expect of a transformation. Country 1 for Game Boy Color does an odd mix of the previous formulas, and it truly gets the worst of both worlds. This is the single greatest issue with this version of the game to me. Every animal buddy is visually a transformation, that way it avoids the issues of Land 1. And this seems fine, but upon being hit, the animal reverts back to the Kongs and the buddy disappears entirely. We can't quickly jump back on them to undo our mistake, they're gone, completely. If you're not a skilled player of this game, and I must stress, this limited Game Boy Color version of the game with different physics, you'll rarely blast on through with these buddies. They feel more like traditional power-ups, which is a lot less fun or forgiving. The obvious answer is to get good at this particular version, which is a tall ask since this is a novelty option, and everyone would rather play the real console version. At least these buddies look great. Espresso looks great here, and he was a neglected animal buddy, so it's good to see him in colour, since his only other Game Boy appearance beforehand was back in 1995. And we have Winky. My boy Winky is back, and this is his first time being crushed into an 8-bit sprite, and I love it. Look at him blink, I can't be mad at that face. And as the only member of the Winky Defense Force, I am thrilled to say his debut level, the terribly short Winky's Walkway, has been extended. We get more Winky. In theory, since one hidden is gone. Yeah, this is insulting. On your first playthrough, this is just a Kong walkway. This is all skipping way ahead, I didn't even discuss the rest of World 1. Ropey Rampage doesn't have the weather effects anymore, and the rest of the world is basically what you'd expect but uglier and with less animal buddies, unless you're good at the game. And yeah, there isn't really much to say. Except I was lying, we have Candy Kong's challenges and oh, it's already over. Each world has a Candy Kong challenge now, which are short, initially not challenging challenges. And they can never be replayed, so they will never stick with you. Though some of the later ones are really fun, and I actually wish I could go back to them. They made collecting the spinning letters like a bonus stage to be actually kind of more fun now with extra modifiers. And there's this one that's like a condensed version of the gimmick from Slip Slide Ride. Yeah, there's not much to say because they can't be replayed. Whoops. But what is worth talking about is what isn't here. We no longer have Candy's save point because this game saves after every level now. This is a big deal, and if you don't think it is, then you don't understand how much harder this version is to play at first. With all that said, I don't want to downplay how great a feature this actually is. It lends itself wonderfully to a handheld system. Little Timmy circa 2000 wouldn't need to beat a level, go to Funky's Flights, go back to an earlier world, use a previously discovered Candy save point, and then turn off the Game Boy before going back to whatever it is kids do. Instead, little Timmy would just beat a level, turn off their Game Boy and go back to school or whatever. The frankly more playable and far more popular Game Boy Advance version would also include more traditional saving, but they repurposed Candy Kong into a dancing minigame. And that's a story for like 5 years from now when I run out of other ways to talk about Donkey Kong. As a whole, this game is remarkably similar to the original game, and that shouldn't be surprising, but it still is an accomplishment that it did this on such inferior hardware. The only hang-ups are the feel and the animal buddies, which I get is like the entirety of playing the game, but everything, once you get accustomed to that, becomes great. Okay, that's a stretch. But now that I'm familiar with this, I have no issues playing the game at all, and this went from a fun novelty to a version I'll play every now and then, I suppose. The visuals are obviously pared down. We only have one Kong on screen, and very limited environments, obviously. But there's a lot of cool, subtle effects that are lost here, or supplemented to feel very different. Weather and time of day transitions never naturally occur anymore. Every level has to feel static in its lighting. And in the case of something like Snow Barrel Blast, a level that used to have an oppressive atmosphere seeping its way through as you progressed, which saw the island itself become hostile, a real reminder of how far the Kongs are from their home. Instead, we have a fun and colourful looking snowy playground. It feels like the light-hearted holiday locations in the third game's Northern Hemisphere. This isn't bad, it's just different, and it really goes to show how much the original game was propped up by its strong visual identity. At least Country on Game Boy Color knew to steal the original HUD, which is never intrusive here. Things like collectibles and lives only show up when they need to, for example when the number of them changes. But we now have an extra HUD addition since we have to display the second Kong in tandem due to only having one rented at a time. but even this is subtle and tucked away in the corner, it's never distracting. The Land trilogy, on the other hand, had an overbearing HUD at all times on the bottom of the screen, which showed everything, so thankfully this was done away with, and nothing of value was lost. This is the only time I'll ever say anything bad about Donkey Kong Land 3. The very different atmosphere also extends to the multiple levels of the game that used to play with darkness. Perhaps to keep things from getting unplayable on an original Game Boy Color model. These levels, with the aid of a modern lit display, are incredibly easy to navigate even when we're supposed to be in the dark. But even on actual hardware, it's still possible to make out the platforms, and that's because people that played early Game Boys had super-powered eyes and could see everything even when it shouldn't be possible. So now these levels are more fast-paced than ever, and we never need to stop and start to see the environment. It getting bright is just an option now. This is especially the case with Squawks' one level, where he used to just light what was in front of you. Now he just lights up everything like he's Goku on Yakon's planet. It's kind of overkill, but I can't imagine a Game Boy Color game smoothly rendering all this, and a proper light source dependent on our location, all in real time without chugging, so I'll accept this. Also on this note, Stop and Go Station gets very red and very green, and Misty Mine now changes the screen's palette on occasion to simulate the mist. But none of this compares with this being the only Donkey Kong platformer that I know of with the rare cow. Look at the rare cow. This was a recurring Easter egg in some of the handheld games from Rare back in the day, but now we have the rare cow in Donkey Kong Country. Look at it! Mechanically, one of the biggest differences with this version, which I hadn't alluded to now, is how bouncing on tires works. This is a pretty recurring part of this game, and is often used for secrets and will be instrumental in some bosses. Instead of pressing the button with proper timing to get a high bounce, we just hold the button down and it does all the work for us. I actually prefer this version, even if it did mess with my muscle memory since the SNES original is the only version I grew up with. But with enough time, this new version became my preferred way to play, and it makes some sections a breeze, even if they really weren't that hard earlier, now they're even less so. This completely trivializes the already trivial Neki boss fights. At least the Nekis got their revenge with the one new level of this version, Neki Nightmare. It's odd, the GBA release reincorporated a lot of the better ideas here. That had hold to bounce, the easier saving, and even a new version of a minigame that was added here. But level design wise, it's just a straight copy-paste of the SNES original, which is a shame since it doesn't have Winky's walkway, and the Neki-filled level I just mentioned. These are still exclusive to the one version no one wants to play. Neki Nightmare is a really nice level. It's pretty vanilla and not particularly amazing, but a new level is a new level, and it's not bad. The other versions of this game are lesser for not having this. This is a simple level in Chimp Caverns, slotting right between Misty Mine and Loopy Lights. And the gimmick here is Nekis are everywhere. They shoot projectiles constantly, which killed me more than a few times due to the small screen size. And sometimes they're done in tunnels where you can't jump, so you actually need proper timing. And the rest of the level is you jumping on Nekis as platforms. It's fun, feels pretty ordinary. You know, there's no new biome or new gimmicks, it's not a bonus level for collecting everything. It's just something you have to do before you finish up the game. But like I said, this should be in every version of DKC, and it's a shame most people haven't played it. This level also has some of the green bananas. Oh look, another thing this does like Donkey Kong 64. But instead of working how that game did, here they're like a signpost, near the green banana bunch. If you use Donkey's weird hand slap move that no one's ever used, a secret collectible will uncover itself. These are pretty frequent through the game, and they're just here for the Game Boy printer. Unlock new pictures to print, and while you're in that menu, look at the alphabet, it's funny. B is for K. Rool, F is for Rambi, L is for Donkey Kong, and Q is for Winky. It's a fantastic resource. Other bonuses include 2 new minigames, apparently revolved around Funky and Cranky Kong due to their alliterative names, but they still star Donkey Kong. Funky fishing is a nice little time waster, but not something I get much enjoyment from. I'm sorry for all the funky fishing Game Boy Color fans out there. I'm just not one of you. But Cranky Crosshair? This is really fun. This is a really fun set of coconut gun based games. And look, another DK64 reference. Please believe me when I say this is the sister game to that. These are all seemingly the same on the surface since they use the same controls and presentation, but each one of these has a unique objective and feel. They get the most out of this very limited skeleton, and no two levels feel the same, and this all gets complete with a boss fight against K. Rool on his galleon. I particularly like the sad Donkey Kong icon used to represent your health. Great minigame, I would have loved this as a kid, probably. And best of all, this is represented with a map screen that just goes left from the original DK Island. All this was here to the left the whole time, and we had no idea until this game came out. Back onto the main campaign, Oil Drum Alley's infamous bonus room hidden inside another bonus room is actually easily accessible. You still have to hit a single banana 3 times, but whether you're Diddy or Donkey, just destroying the wall on the right gets you in. This alone makes this feel like the definitive release at times. And of course, this was all re-broken for the Game Boy Advance version for the sake of purity. DKC GBA had some messed up priorities. Had it up to here with that. It got rid of a new level, the extended level. They broke the fixed bonus room, and they didn't include a rare cow. Does it have anything that makes it a better version of the game besides just looking and playing and sounding a lot better? Oh, it has new biomes for funky fishing, that's great. Before you correct me, yes, I know the GBA version has improved boss fights, as well as a bunch of other things that I will get to much later with my life. But for people like me that want Donkey Kong to look like a scary demon with big titties, the Game Boy Color version is just comfy. Plus this GBC version has the best pause screen. Oh, don't believe me? Super Nintendo, pause. It just paused. Game Boy Advance? Okay, it paused. It shows the word pause, that's nice. But this middle child, you hit pause, and you're presented with the word pause pulsating. Not only is this stylish, but it will probably reduce screen burn-ins very slightly. Getting to the final stage, the Gangplank Galleon, has us fight what is, in my opinion, the most stylish looking K. Rool. They crunched him down to 8-bit without making him the tiny DK Land version, and this is still his most iconic design. It's him as the king. But with the Game Boy Color's limited palette, it all makes him pop. Our protagonists are just brown blobs, but here is K. Rool as a detailed green blob with yellow accents and a beautiful red cape. And after he's defeated, we get the credits for the Game Boy Color team for Donkey Kong Country, some other rare stuff. Nintendo of America, Nintendo of Europe, Nintendo of Germany, Nintendo of Spain, Nintendo of France, Nintendo of Italy, and some special thanks. If you love credits, this is the game for you. And then we get Diddy Kong telling us other secrets await on other barrel options. And then we get a version of Donkey Kong that will traumatize young children. The other barrel modes for this game are 2 harder difficulty modifiers, which I love as a value proposition. One removes checkpoints from levels, and the other removes DK barrels. These can't be combined for some kind of super hard run, unfortunately, but as they stand, they're both very fun ways to replay this game if you enjoy this game. If not, this will just make it worse. The no DK barrel mode isn't some kind of super duper hard mode. You start every level with both Kongs, but it just means you can't heal mid-level outside of dying and restarting at the checkpoint. Because of the secrets requiring Donkey Kong's ground pound move, it means this mode especially prioritizes keeping Donkey safe. Getting to those green bananas with Diddy is no good. Playing these 2 modes is what made me feel more comfortable with this odd feeling game, and I'm now kinda decent at it, not to brag. Granted, I'm much better at the original or GBA versions, and going from this to that is like Goku taking off his weighted clothes. 2 Dragon Ball references in one video. I didn't plan for that, don't read too much into that. But people instantly dismiss this version for feeling different, or for being quickly made obsolete. But as one of the few people alive that enjoys the Donkey Kong Land trilogy for Game Boy, This is an excellent sequel to those. And as a fan of the original Donkey Kong Country, this is a fun variation. And best of all, it's a snapshot of an exact moment in video game history. This was the last possible moment something like this could have come out and been cutting edge. And I love this. They made this instead of, not making this and planning for the Game Boy Advance. And I respect that. I know on an intellectual level, this is the worst playing version of the original game, but like I said, I love it. It swung for the fences with content exclusive to it that will never be seen again. Thank you for making the Rare Cow canon to the Donkey Kong Country series, and everything else you included as well. But sometimes I play good versions of good games too. That's why the next video will be seeing double. 4 Final Fantasies. Sorry, I meant to say Final Fantasy IV, but there will be 2 versions of it that were for years seen as the best 2 remakes on the go. The PSP release and the 3D release for the Nintendo DS. And then Square Enix had to ruin my plans by having the Pixel remaster come out for Switch. Well, I'm not playing a 3rd version of this game, so come back next time for Final Fantasy IV on PSP and DS. They're good versions too. Between this and Digimon World Next Order, companies have been ruining videos I've had planned for ages with sudden Switch port announcements. I sure hope Microsoft don't ruin my planned video on It's Mr. Pants by bringing it to Nintendo Switch. That would be a shame. But seriously, just give the world an easy way to play this game officially, please. I love It's Mr. Pants. It's so good, but no one believes me. Please re-release it.